Deputy Fleming.
Thank you, Concorla. Tánaiste, there have been many debates about the pros and cons of selling state assets. The government correctly withdrew the option of selling Cuilche, and that was the right decision. You'll be aware that Fine Gael had a plan in 2009 to sell off a lot of state assets with the view of creating new jobs. But Minister, you may be aware this morning here, an hour ago in this chamber, Minister Howland confirmed that there have been no proceeds received to date whatever in respect of the sale of state assets. None will be received by the 15th of December when the Troika leave. None will be received in this calendar year whatever. So it is clear now that, and we all welcome the departure of the Troika on the 15th of December, it is clear that during the 3-year plan no proceeds were received from the sale of state assets. The question is, now that the Troika are leaving and the Troika are not here anymore to ask you to sell state assets, the EU is not asking you to sell state assets, nobody on this side of the House is asking you to sell state assets. The question is, why in 2014 is the Labour...
Sorry, would you please. Sorry, would you please allow the Deputy to pose his question?
I continue. The question is, why is the Labour Party, headed by yourself, ably assisted by Minister Rabbitte beside you, determined to proceed with the sale of Bord Gáis in 2014, to proceed with the sale of power generation plants owned by the ESB in this country, when nobody other than Fine Gael is asking you to do so? I am asking you, will you as a Labour Party leader please now move away from your programme from government commitment? It may have been there intended to be part of the Troika arrangement. They are now gone, and nobody is asking you to do it except Fine Gael. Will Labour Party stand up for the national assets?
Thank you. Tánaiste.
Of all the hard-necked hypocrisy that I have heard in this House in the last 3 years, this beats it all. This is wonderful. Here is the party that did a deal with the Troika when they came in here 3 years ago to sell €5 billion worth of state assets. To get €5 billion at the end of 2010, you'd have to sell every state company, every port, every airport, virtually everything that the state owned in terms of assets. That's what you agreed to, and that's what we had to renegotiate. And Brendan Howland renegotiated that with the European Commission, because incidentally your sale of €5 billion was all for the writing down of debt. None of it could be reused for reinvestment in the Irish economy. And the renegotiation, which was done by this government, was for a minimum of €1 billion, a target of €3 billion, and 50% of that to be used for reinvestment in the Irish economy in terms of generating employment. We have always stated in our programme for government that there could be strategic sale of non-strategic state assets, arising from which would generate income that would be reinvested in the economy to generate employment and to bring about economic recovery. And to find Fianna Fáil here, almost to the day, the 3rd anniversary of you bringing the Troika into this country, almost to the day of you putting the country into hock and into receivership, to come in with this cant and hypocrisy and nonsense today, it really does beat Banagher.
Would you please settle down now? Thank you. Please settle down. Thank you. Deputy Fleming. 1 minute, Deputy.
It is clear that I've rattled the Tánaiste. That outburst will go down in history. And in addition to that, Concorla.
Deputies, would you please? Please. just allow the deputy 1 minute, please. Sorry, deputy. Deputy, would you please allow the deputy 1 minute to respond? Thank you.
Thank you, Concordia. And as the Tánaiste knows, there was no mention ever of 5 billion in any agreement with the Troika. As the Tánaiste knows, we've met all our targets on the 12 quarterly reviews. As the Tánaiste knows, we've received no money from the sale of state assets during the 3-year programme. The programme is now ending. The question remains, why is the Labour Party determined to take on the Fine Gael clause and sell national infrastructure, the electricity of generation by the ESB, selling Bord Gáis Energy? Why is the Labour Party, when nobody inside this House other than Fine Gael and nobody outside this House, the IMF is not asking you to sell state assets because they're on their way home. The EU is not asking you to sell state assets. The single question is, why is the Labour Party, when nobody is asking you to do so, determined to sell off our national infrastructure assets?
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, the only you talk about rattle. I mean, the only rattle that we're getting here is the rattle of the decrepit memorandum of understanding, which is still rattling around in the empty vessel that is now Fianna Fáil. Can you make up your mind what your position is? You were in here an hour ago. You were in here an hour ago, asking the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform why state assets hadn't been sold. And why he hadn't raised money to date from the sale of state assets. Yes, it is true. It is true. It is true that you didn't put the 5 billion in the memorandum of understanding. But it was very clear. No. It was very clear. It was very clear that that was the clear understanding that you had with the Troika, and that was certainly made known to us when the government was formed. The fact of the matter is that we are now exiting the Troika programme that you put us into it. If you had had your way, we would now be in a position, instead of you coming in complaining here today that no money has been raised from the sale of state assets, we would be in a position today that virtually every port, airport, every state company would already have been sold, because that was the effect. That was the effect of what you had agreed with the Troika, and it takes some neck and some hypocrisy to come in here today and to raise this issue of all issues. Go back, make up your mind where you stand on the issue, make up your mind as to where you stand on investment in the economy and the creation of jobs. Happily, this country is in a position that we have now taken the country out of the bailout that you put us into, and we're moving to economic recovery.
Deputy McLaughlin, thank you.
Tánaiste, there are reports in this morning's media that the Garda Commissioner has demanded the return of files from the Public Accounts Committee in relation to the penalty points debacle. Tánaiste, I hope you'll agree that this is a disturbing development. Let's just recap over what's happened here. We have 2 Garda whistleblowers who were very concerned about practice in relation to the termination of penalty points. They reported their concerns to the internal Garda confidential recipient in March 2012. It went nowhere. They were essentially stonewalled for months. Then, in autumn of 2012, under the Garda Síochána Act, Section 62 of the Garda Síochána Act 2005, they passed the evidence they had onto members of the Houses of the Oireachtas, as they were entitled to do. No investigation had taken place within the Garda Síochána that we're aware of until they passed that information over. They were discredited, they were talked down after that. We then had an internal Garda investigation that was not in the public interest. There should have been an independent investigation, but when that was published, the Minister for Justice, Alan Shatter, sought to discredit the whistleblowers and downplay the extent of what was and what is a scandal, and the ongoing attempts then after that to discredit the Garda whistleblowers. But they have been vindicated. We now have the reports of the Comptroller and Auditor General. which reveals that 1 in 5 motorists facing offences got off. Half of all summonses that should have been served in relation to road traffic offences were not actually served. This was a widespread problem. In some districts, they had 50 times more terminations than other districts in the state. So we have a real major problem. We have revelations that senior journalists, judges, one state solicitor allegedly had penalty points terminated.
Thank you.
The public need to know all the facts. So, Tánaiste, will you ensure that the Public Accounts Committee can do its work with the evidence they have and reveal the full facts on what was a scandal, and thanks to these whistleblowers, is now not going to happen in the future, because there are now clear directives to all Gardaí around the termination of penalty points and the framework that they operate in. Will you stand by the whistleblowers and protect them from this latest assault?
Well, first of all, I haven't had notice of this question, and there's a level of detail in it about which I am not briefed. But let me say this. First of all, on the issue, as I understand it, the Controller and Auditor General's report obviously goes to the Public Accounts Committee. As far as the government is concerned, the Public Accounts Committee is free to do its job. We do not seek to influence, and will not seek to influence how the Public Accounts Committee does its job. The Minister for Justice takes very seriously the allegations which have been made, and clearly those allegations have to be fully investigated. On the issue of whistleblowers, I think it's fair to say that this government has made very clear its position in relation to whistleblowers. We introduced legislation for the first time ever in the history of this state to protect whistleblowers, to prevent whistleblowers from being dismissed from their employment, to prevent them from being discriminated in their employment. That legislation passed yesterday in the Seanad. And that is the legislation that we're committed to. So our position in relation to whistleblowers, I think, couldn't be clearer. This is the first government that has introduced legislation to protect whistleblowers, that people within our public service, or people who become aware of any wrongdoing, that they can bring that wrongdoing to the attention of the appropriate authorities, have it investigated, and be sure that there isn't going to be recrimination against them. As far as the report of the Controller and Auditor General is concerned, I mean, clearly that is a matter for the Public Accounts Committee, and the government supports the Public Accounts Committee in the role that it has to exercise in dealing with that report.
Tánaiste, I've spoke to one of the whistleblowers this morning, and they've advised me that they were encouraged in correspondence by the Minister for Justice to bring all the evidence they had into the public domain, to bring them to the appropriate mechanisms within the state. The whistleblower has given that file, that dossier of evidence that he has, to the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee. He's been prevented, the chairperson, in my view, from doing his job if the Garda Commissioner demands the return of those files. Tánaiste, I do acknowledge that there is whistleblower legislation in there, and I acknowledge that your colleague Minister Howland is leading up on that. I acknowledge that it's a commitment in the programme for government. But Tánaiste, what message are we sending out to potential whistleblowers out there? Imagine if we had had people within the financial services who had shouted stop. Would we have the crisis we have today if we had had legislation there for them? So here we have two very brave men, one of them who's had to leave the force, the other one who I'm sure is thinking about leaving every day under severe pressure for taking a stand, for changing a system that was clearly now demonstrably wrong, as proven conclusively by the Controller and Auditor General. I'm asking you again, Tánaiste, will you stand by these two whistleblowers and ensure that the evidence they have very courageously given to the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee is fully examined by that committee, and all the facts and all the lessons can be learned? I ask you again, will you stand by them and then give this legislation that's coming through the best chance to be a real success in the future?
Tánaiste.
Well, first of all, it shouldn't come as any surprise to anybody that the Minister for Justice would encourage whistleblowers or people who have information to bring it to attention. That's what he has. That's what he has done. There is an investigation, which, as you've said, is being carried out. As a report from the, as I understand, a report from the Controller and Auditor General. This matter is before the Public Accounts Committee. It is the government's view that the Public Accounts Committee should do its job. We support the Public Accounts Committee in doing that job. In relation to whistleblowers, we are in the process of bringing legislation forward. As I said, the whistleblowers legislation has passed in the Seanad. It will come before this House. As I understand it, it extends the persons to whom information may be brought to their attention, includes members of the Dáil and now members of the Seanad. There should not be wrongdoing. If we had legislation like this in the past, some of the wrongdoing that has happened in the past, and some of which you referred to yourself, wouldn't have taken place. I think it is appropriate that it is Minister Howlin who is leading for the government on this legislation, because there are a few people in this House who understand, as well as Minister Howlin, what happens or what did happen when information was brought in his case to himself in relation to wrongdoing, when he sought to bring that to the attention of the then Minister for Justice at the time. Didn't come in here and make wild allegations, but brought the information to the then Minister for Justice and ended up in the courts for his trouble, and was considerably at considerable risk as a result of that whole process. We will now have whistleblowers legislation which will protect whistleblowers, so that people, if they see something being done that is wrong, can bring that to attention and can have it dealt with. And I look forward to seeing the Public Accounts Committee doing its work on the report from the Controller and Auditor General that it has before it.
Deputy Donnelly.
Thanks, Cian Curley. Tánaiste, the woman was charged in court yesterday with the crime of assisting the suicide of a multiple sclerosis sufferer. The charge comes under Section 2 of the 1993 Criminal Law Act, and it carries a penalty of up to 14 years in prison. This was the first court case of its kind in Ireland, and the case is being watched very closely by a constituent of mine, Mary Fleming. Mary has lived with multiple sclerosis herself for 35 years. Now, as you know, Tánaiste, earlier this year, Mary and her partner, Tom Curran, went to the Supreme Court to challenge the constitutionality of the 1993 Act. And the court did not find it to be unconstitutional, but in the judgment the following was said: nothing should be taken as necessarily implying that it would not be open to the state, in the event that the Oireachtas was satisfied that measures with appropriate safeguards could be introduced, to legislate to deal with a case such as the appellant. So what of the appellant? I spoke with Tom this morning, Tánaiste, and he said that Mary's condition has worsened since the Supreme Court case. He told me that Mary is now completely immobile, other than her mouth. He told me that Mary is in constant pain, and the last time they tried to adjust her pain medication to deal with the increase in pain, she lapsed into a coma. So they can't do that anymore. Mary's ability to swallow is getting worse, making it increasingly difficult for her to eat. Tom said, Tánaiste, that Mary wants to live, and that she has a lot of reasons to live. But her ability to eat may deteriorate, and Mary has said that she is adamant she won't use artificial feeding. In that case, under the current legislation, Mary Fleming would starve to death. I asked Tom this morning what question Mary would put to you, and I think indeed to all of us in the Oireachtas. And he told me that she would ask us the following: come and live my life for 24 hours and see if you think helping me to die should be a crime. Come and spend 24 hours in my house and see what you think. He said Mary would ask for all of us to protect her family, that she would ask us in the Oireachtas to change the law so that she could die on her own terms without the threat of Tom Curran spending 14 years in prison. When I raised this with Minister Shatter earlier this year, Tánaiste, he told me that the government would not consider changing the law, as he is obliged to have regard to the wider public interest. So my question, Tánaiste, is a very simple one. Do you, as Tánaiste, believe that Tom Curran, Mary's partner, should face the threat, as is the case under current legislation, of 14 years in prison for assisting Mary to die if she so chooses in the future? Thank you.
Tánaiste.
Well, first of all, I'm conscious that there is a case currently before the courts in relation to what is known as assisted suicide. And you'll appreciate that while that case is before the courts, I cannot comment on that case, nor indeed do I think any member of the House should comment on it. I also think that perhaps it is best that that case concludes before, as legislators, we have a discussion here on the issue of assisted suicide. I met with Tom Curran after the Mary Fleming case. It is my view, you asked me a straight question, it is my view that as legislators we should address this issue here in this House. I think it's a difficult issue. I have enormous sympathy for the situation that Tom and Mary find themselves in. But, you know, there is no simple answer to this. This is, you know, when we come to look at this issue in terms of legislation, this isn't going to be a simple, straightforward issue. There are a range of ethical, of legal, of all kinds of issues that are associated with this topic. And I think that this is a topic that I think we should address as legislators collectively. You know, I don't think that this should be a kind of a government opposition type of issue. I think it's a topic that we should address first of all as human beings, as legislators. I think we should approach it putting ourselves in the situation that Tom and Barry are in, and I think we should address it very, very honestly. And I think we should also address it because I think the area of assisted suicide. There's the issue of what is then opened up in a situation where what is now known as assisted suicide is legislated for. And there are obviously some of the considerations, and you mentioned the Minister for Justice responded to it. There are obviously considerations that the Minister for Justice and his department will inevitably, and legal advice will inevitably have on it. But I do think it is something that we need to address. I think perhaps if I could make a suggestion on it, I think that once the present court case is over, I think that we should find a way, collectively, maybe through one of the Oireachtas committees, of having this issue dealt with in a non-partisan way. It is an issue, I think, that does require to be dealt with legislatively. You know, we've seen the Supreme Court judgment, and I read the Supreme Court judgment. I read it at the time that I met with Tom. But the straight answer to your question, Deputy Donnelly, is yes, I do think we should deal with this as legislators.
Donnelly.
Thank you, Tánaiste. And I would like to say I agree. I think with virtually everything you said, it is a complex issue and it is something that the Oireachtas needs to address. Tánaiste, you're very familiar with the case. You'll know that both Tom and Mary have asked that guidelines be put in place, issued by the DPP, probably with guidance and potentially legislative backup from the Oireachtas, so that the DPP can provide guidance on what is considered a qualifying case where a penalty would not apply. Now, the UK DPP has such guidelines already in place, and I believe we need them here very quickly. I agree we can't talk about the current case. I do think, however, Tánaiste, that we should be able to debate this while the current case is going on. We've no idea how long this is going to take. It's the first case of its kind in the country. It could take a very long time. And I would hate, as I'm sure you would, to have to meet anyone in Tom Curran's situation and explain that we weren't able to change the law in time. So could I ask you to consider this? As a reasonable input to any Oireachtas debate, an expert report may be very useful. It seems to me that an expert report could be concluded quickly and could be done in a way that did not interfere with the current case before the courts. So can I ask you to consider if you would commission an expert report to be concluded reasonably quickly, which we in the Oireachtas could then use as input to a debate to changing the legislation on this as soon as possible. Thank you.
I just remind members that under Standing Order 57, there is an obligation to refrain from comment which might affect proceedings in progress.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Well, as I've said, we can't discuss the case that is in progress. You've mentioned guidelines that the DPP might operate. The DPP is entirely independent, and we respect that independence. You've made a suggestion of that perhaps a way should be found to, have an expert report compiled on this issue. I think that's a very positive suggestion, and it's one that I'll discuss with my colleagues in government.
Thank you. That completes leaders' questions for today.